Some truths don't knock. They walk into the room and make the powerful forget how to breathe. The ballroom shimmered under crystal chandeliers, soft gold light reflecting off polished marble floors as cameras hovered like silent witnesses, capturing every second of Ethan Whitmore's keynote speech. His voice was steady, practiced, the voice of a man who built empires and never lost control, until the moment the doors at the back opened and a small figure stepped inside. The boy couldn't have been more than 5, dressed in a neat navy suit that didn't quite hide the quiet confidence in his posture, his shoes tapping lightly against the floor as he walked forward, each step drawing attention without asking for it. The murmurs started low, barely audible, then grew as heads turned, eyes narrowed, phones subtly lifted. Ethan didn't notice at first, still speaking about growth, precision, control, until the energy in the room shifted in a way no numbers could explain. His voice faltered for half a second, just enough for instinct to take over, and he looked up. Time didn't slow. It stopped, because the child standing 10 feet away didn't just look familiar. He looked identical. The same sharp jawline softened by youth. The same steady eyes that seemed to study the world instead of reacting to it. The same presence Ethan had spent a lifetime refining. A quiet crack formed beneath the surface of the room as whispers threaded through the crowd like electricity. Ethan's chest tightened, breath caught halfway, his mind rejecting what his eyes refused to deny. Then, just behind the boy, she appeared. Amara Collins didn't rush, didn't hesitate. Her steps measured, calm, as if she had already lived this moment 100 times in her head and stripped it of its power. Her skin glowed under the chandelier light, her posture straight, her expression unreadable, not cold, not warm, simply certain. 5 years had passed since the night she walked out of his penthouse with nothing but silence and a truth he never stopped to ask about. 5 years where she built a life that didn't need his permission to exist. Now she stood just beyond his reach, not as someone returning, but as someone who had already moved on. The boy stopped near the center of the room, turning slightly as if guided not by fear, but by quiet understanding, and for the first time in his career, Ethan Whitmore had nothing to say. His world, once measured in deals and outcomes, narrowed to a single question that pressed against his chest like it had always been there, waiting. His voice, when it finally came, was lower, stripped of authority, almost unfamiliar even to himself. Is he mine? The room held its breath, cameras steady, lights unblinking, but Amara didn't answer. She simply stepped forward, placed her hand gently in her son's, and in that silence, something far louder than words settled into the space between them, something Ethan couldn't negotiate, couldn't control, and couldn't undo. The silence did not break, it stretched, thin and tight, as if the entire room was holding its breath in a space that suddenly felt too small for truth. Ethan's hand lowered slowly from the microphone, his fingers curling slightly, as though he needed something to anchor himself. But there was nothing left to hold on to except the reality standing a few feet away. The boy did not look scared. He did not hide behind Amara. He simply stood there with a quiet steadiness that did not belong to someone his age, his small chest rising and falling in a rhythm that felt almost deliberate, as if he had learned early how to stand in rooms that were not built for him. Amara's fingers closed gently around his hand, not protective, not possessive, just present, the kind of touch that said everything without needing to explain. She did not look at Ethan, not yet, her gaze resting somewhere beyond him, past the cameras, past the crowd, as if she had already walked through this moment and left it behind long before stepping into the room. 5 years earlier, the night had been quiet in a different way, the kind of quiet that settles after words have already done their damage. The city lights had stretched across the glass walls of Ethan's penthouse, sharp and distant, while his voice, calm and controlled, had cut through the air with a finality that left no space for questions. There had been no shouting, no chaos, just a decision made in the language of logic and reputation, a future mapped out without room for anything unexpected. Amara had stood there, one hand resting lightly against her stomach, the weight of something unspoken pressing beneath her ribs, and in that moment she understood that some truths were not meant to be negotiated, they were meant to be protected. She had not argued, she had not tried to change his mind, Because dignity does not beg for permission to exist. Instead, she turned, picked up the small bag she had packed in silence, and walked out into the night without looking back, the sound of the door closing behind her softer than anything he would remember, but louder than anything he would ever forget. Back in the present, the glow of the chandeliers felt colder, sharper, reflecting off surfaces that no longer held the same certainty. Ethan's eyes finally shifted, not to Amara, but to the boy, studying every detail as if repetition might change what he was seeing, but it only made it clearer, more undeniable. The same eyes that did not rush to speak, the same stillness that came from observing before reacting. Traits he had once called discipline, now standing in front of him as something he had never known existed. The crowd began to move again, subtle shifts, quiet whispers, the soft hum of phones capturing what would become a story before the night even ended, but none of it reached him. For the first time, the world he controlled moved without his direction. Amara finally lifted her gaze, not with anger, not with softness, but with a calm that carried the weight of years he had never witnessed. Her voice, when it came, was steady, measured, the kind of tone that did not need to rise to be heard. "You built a life where there was no room for us," she said, each word landing without force yet impossible to ignore. "So I made one where we did not need you." The words did not echo. They settled, heavy and complete, leaving no space for argument or revision. Ethan swallowed, the motion subtle but strained, as if even that required effort now, his mind searching for something to say, something to fix, but there were no numbers to adjust, no strategy to deploy. This was not a problem, it was a consequence. The boy shifted slightly, his fingers tightening around Amara's hand for just a second before relaxing again. And in that small movement Ethan saw something he could not calculate, a bond formed in moments he had never been part of, in nights he had never stayed awake for, in years he had never lived. Amara turned, guiding her son with a quiet gesture, not hurried, not hesitant, simply moving forward as if the path had always been clear to her. They passed him without stopping, without waiting, without asking for anything, and as the distance between them grew, Ethan felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, not loud, not dramatic, but steady and undeniable. It was the realization that some doors do not close with noise, they close with silence. And by the time you hear it, there is nothing left on the other side to open again. The doors closed behind Amara and her son with a softness that felt louder than any applause. And for a moment Ethan did not move, did not speak, did not even breathe the way he used to when control came naturally to him. The room slowly began to return to itself, voices rising in cautious waves, glasses clinking again, cameras lowering as if unsure whether the moment had ended or just begun. But Ethan remained exactly where he was, his gaze fixed on the space she had just occupied, as if the air itself still held her presence. His assistant stepped closer, voice low, careful, asking if he wanted to continue the speech, if he needed the car brought around, if he wanted the press handled, but Ethan did not answer right away, because for the first time those things felt distant, irrelevant, like echoes from a life that had suddenly shifted out of reach. When he finally spoke, his voice lacked the sharp certainty that usually defined it. "Find out everything," he said quietly, not looking away, not specifying names, because he did not need to, and that alone unsettled the people around him more than any command he had ever given. Outside, the night air carried a different kind of silence, cooler, steady, the kind that did not demand attention. Amara walked toward the waiting car with her son beside her, his small hand still in hers, his steps matching hers without question, without hesitation. He glanced up at her once, eyes searching not for answers but for reassurance. And she gave it to him without words, a slight squeeze of her fingers, a calm nod, the kind of quiet communication built over years that no one else had witnessed. The car door opened, and as they stepped inside, the city lights reflected softly against the glass, blurring the edges of everything behind them. Inside the vehicle, the world felt contained, steady, separate from the noise they had just left. "Was that him?" the boy asked after a moment, his voice small but clear, not afraid, just curious. Amara looked at him, really looked, taking in the shape of his face, the quiet strength already settling into his posture. and she answered with the same honesty she had chosen every day since he was born. Yes, she said gently. That was him. He considered that for a second, then nodded as if placing the information where it belonged, not letting it take more space than it needed, and turned his attention to the window again, watching the city pass by in soft streaks of light. Amara leaned back slightly, her shoulders relaxing into the seat, not from relief, but from certainty. Because this moment had never been about confrontation, it had always been about confirmation. 5 years of choices had led here. Choices made in quiet rooms, in early mornings and late nights, in moments when no one was watching and no one was applauding. She remembered the first apartment, small and bare, the sound of the heater clicking through cold nights, the way she held her newborn son close as if warmth alone could build a future. She remembered working through exhaustion, building something piece by piece, not for recognition, not for revenge, but for stability, for dignity, for a life that did not depend on someone else's approval. Back at the venue, Ethan finally moved, stepping off the stage with a composure that looked familiar but felt different, like a mask he had worn so long he forgot what it covered. People approached him, offering measured words, controlled reactions, but he heard none of it clearly, because his mind kept returning to the same image, the same face, the same undeniable truth standing in front of him. He had built an empire by predicting outcomes, by eliminating uncertainty, by making sure nothing slipped beyond his control. Yet somehow the most important part of his life had unfolded entirely without him, beyond his reach, outside his awareness. When he stepped outside into the night, the air hit him sharper than expected, grounding him in a way that numbers and contracts never had. His driver opened the car door, but Ethan paused for a fraction of a second, looking out at the street as if expecting to see something that was already gone. The city moved as it always did, indifferent, constant, untouched by what had just happened inside those walls. And for the first time, Ethan understood that the world did not stop when he lost something. It simply continued, carrying that loss forward whether he was ready for it or not. The drive back was quiet, but not empty, the kind of silence that held meaning instead of avoidance, as the city lights slid across the windows in soft reflections that came and went like memories neither of them needed to name. Amara sat with her hand resting lightly over her son's, her thumb moving in slow, absent circles as if anchoring him to something steady, something certain, while outside the world continued in its usual rhythm. Unaware that anything had shifted at all, her phone remained face down beside her, untouched, because she already knew what it would bring: messages, calls, questions dressed as concern, curiosity disguised as interest, but none of it mattered. Not tonight. Not after 5 years of building a life that no longer required explanation. Across the city, Ethan's car cut through traffic with the same precision it always had, smooth, controlled, directed, but inside, the atmosphere was different, heavier, as if something unseen had settled into the space beside him. His assistant's voice came through the phone, listing updates, requests, adjustments to the schedule, all the things that once defined the structure of his day, but the words blurred together, losing shape before they could land. Ethan stared out the window, watching the reflection of his own face shift with the passing lights, searching for something familiar and finding something else instead, something less certain, less composed. When he finally spoke, his tone was quieter than usual, not weak, but measured in a way that suggested he was choosing each word instead of relying on instinct. "I want everything from 5 years ago," he said. "Every record, every detail, every place she could have gone." And the silence on the other end of the line lasted just a second longer than it should have before the response came. "Yes, sir." The call ended, but the quiet remained, pressing in around him as the realization settled deeper, not sharp, not sudden, but steady, like something that had always been there waiting to be acknowledged. Back in the car, the boy shifted closer to Amara, his head leaning lightly against her arm, not out of fear, but out of comfort, the kind that came from knowing exactly where he belonged. "Are we going home?" he asked softly, his voice already drifting towards sleep. Amara glanced down at him, her expression softening just enough to reveal what she rarely showed the world: warmth without hesitation. "Yes," she said, brushing a curl gently away from his forehead. "We are going home." The word carried weight, not because of where it was, but because of what it represented, a place built intentionally, piece by piece, far from the version of life she once thought she needed. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, not to escape, but to settle into the certainty she had earned, the kind that did not depend on who stayed or who left. The car slowed as it turned onto a quieter street, lined with trees that filtered the city noise into something softer, something distant, and when it finally stopped, the driver stepped out without a word, opening the door with a quiet efficiency that matched the tone of the night. Amara stepped out first, then reached back for her son, lifting him carefully into her arms as he rested fully against her shoulder, his breathing slow and even. The house stood ahead, modest compared to the spaces she once occupied, but grounded in a way those places never were, its warm light spilling gently onto the front steps, steady and inviting. Inside, everything was exactly as she had left it. Not perfect, not curated for anyone else's approval, just lived in, real, hers. She carried him to his room, tucking him into bed with practiced ease, pulling the blanket up just enough, her hand lingering for a second longer than necessary, as if sealing the quiet promise she had made years ago. When she stepped back into the hallway, the house fell into a calm that felt complete, not waiting for anything more. Miles away, Ethan stepped into his penthouse, the space unchanged, immaculate, every surface exactly where it had always been. But something in it felt different now, not because it had changed, but because he had. He walked past the glass walls overlooking the city, the same view that once symbolized everything he had built, and for the first time, it felt distant, almost detached, as if it belonged to someone who no longer stood there. He loosened his tie slightly, a small gesture that would have meant nothing before, but now felt like the first crack in a structure he had never questioned. And as he stood there in the quiet, the image returned again, not fading, not softening, but clear, undeniable, a child with his face, walking past him without hesitation, without recognition, carrying a life that had been lived entirely without him. And in that moment, Ethan understood something no success had ever taught him, that absence does not always feel like emptiness. Sometimes it feels like being replaced by something you were never there to become. Morning arrived without ceremony, the kind of quiet light that filtered through the windows gently, touching the edges of Amara's home without demanding attention. And for a moment, everything felt still in the way only a life built with intention could be. The kitchen carried the soft hum of routine, the low sound of the coffee machine, the faint scrape of a chair as her son climbed into his seat, his movements unhurried, familiar, grounded in a space that had always been his. Amara stood by the counter, her hands steady as she poured a glass of milk, her mind not racing, not replaying the night before, because she had already lived through the hardest parts long before that moment ever came. "Are we going to school today?" he asked, swinging his feet slightly above the floor, his voice carrying the normalcy that had never been interrupted, and she nodded with a small smile, placing the glass in front of him. "Yes, nothing changes," she said, not as reassurance, but as truth. Across the city, Ethan's morning began differently, not with routine, but with disruption that did not show on the surface. His office overlooked the skyline, the same view that had once centered him, but today it felt like something to look through rather than something to stand on. Files had already been placed on his desk, thin folders at first, then thicker ones as information began to surface. Names, addresses, timelines that stretched across 5 years he had never witnessed. He sat down, slowly, not out of hesitation, but because for the first time the act of sitting carried weight. His assistant stood across from him, composed but observant, waiting for direction, but Ethan did not speak immediately, his eyes scanning the first page with a focus that felt different from his usual precision, less about control, more about understanding. The address came first, a neighborhood he would have never associated with her, followed by employment records, small at the beginning, incremental, then growing into something structured, something stable. There were no signs of collapse, no evidence of struggle that aligned with the narrative he had once assumed would follow her departure. Instead, there was consistency, resilience, quiet progress that had unfolded without announcement. Ethan leaned back slightly, his fingers resting against the edge of the desk as the realization continued to settle, not in sharp bursts, but in a steady accumulation that reshaped everything he thought he knew. She never contacted anyone from your circle, his assistant added carefully. No financial ties, no requests, no attempts to return. And the statement lingered in the room, heavier than any accusation, because it confirmed something he had not yet said out loud. She had not needed him. Back in her home, Amara helped her son with his jacket, smoothing the fabric over his shoulders with a practiced ease that came from repetition, from years of small moments that built something larger than any single event. You did well. Yesterday, she said quietly, her voice carrying pride without pressure, and he looked up at her with a small nod, not seeking approval, but acknowledging it. I just stood there, he replied, and she smiled faintly. Sometimes that is enough. Outside, the morning air was crisp, the kind that sharpened focus without discomfort, and as they walked toward the car, her phone buzzed softly in her bag. The first of what she knew would be many attempts to reach her, but she did not check it, not because she was avoiding it, but because she was not defined by it. Ethan closed the file slowly, the sound of paper against paper quieter than it should have been, and for a moment he sat there, not moving, not speaking, as the space around him seemed to shift in meaning. Everything he had built was still there, intact, functioning, but something fundamental had changed in the way he saw it, not as a measure of what he had gained, but as a reminder of what he had overlooked. He stood, walking toward the window with a pace that remained controlled, but carried a different intention, as if he was no longer moving to maintain order, but to confront something he had not prepared for. The city stretched out below him, unchanged, relentless in its movement, and somewhere within it, a life existed that had grown entirely beyond his reach, not because it had been taken from him, but because he had never stepped into it. And for the first time, Ethan Whitmore understood that absence is not defined by distance. It is defined by the moments you were never there to live, and no amount of power could rewrite that. The day unfolded with a rhythm that did not wait for anyone to catch up, the city moving in its usual patterns while two lives carried entirely different weights beneath the same sky. Amara sat in her office, the soft hum of conversation and distant keyboards filling the space with a quiet productivity that felt earned rather than imposed. Her desk organized, but not sterile, papers arranged with purpose, not perfection. Sunlight filtered through the large windows behind her, casting a warm, steady glow that softened the edges of everything around her, including the past that no longer held power over her present. Her phone buzzed again, this time persistent, the same number repeating in a way that suggested intention rather than coincidence, and she glanced at it briefly, her expression unchanged, before turning it face down once more, not out of avoidance, but out of clarity, across the city. Ethan stood in his office with the same phone in his hand, his thumb hovering over the call button for a fraction longer than necessary, as if the action required something more than decision, something closer to acceptance. He had reviewed every page, every record, every detail of the life she had built, and none of it aligned with the version of her he had once convinced himself would exist without him. There were no gaps, no signs of instability, only growth, measured and deliberate, the kind that came from someone who had chosen their path without looking back. He pressed the call button. The line rang once, twice, 3 times, each second stretching slightly longer than the last, until finally, it connected. There was no greeting. At first, just a quiet presence on the other end, steady and unhurried. Amara, Ethan said, her name sounding different now, not as something he owned, but as something he had to reach for. There was a pause, not uncertain, just intentional, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same calm that had unsettled him the night before. You found the number, she said, not surprised, not impressed, simply acknowledging what was expected. Ethan exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that did little to steady the shift inside him. I need to see you, he said, the words direct, but lacking the authority they once carried. On the other end, there was a faint sound, not movement, but consideration, the kind that came from someone who no longer reacted, but chose. You already did, she replied quietly, and for a moment, that was all there was. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, not in frustration, but in recognition of the distance that existed between what he wanted and what she was willing to give. That is not what I mean, he said, his tone softening in a way that felt unfamiliar even to him. We need to talk about him. The word lingered, heavier than anything else he had said, because it carried more than a question. It carried a reality he could not undo. Amara did not respond immediately, and in that silence, the difference between them became clearer than any words could explain. She had lived 5 years in certainty, while he had only just stepped into it. His name is Caleb, she said finally, not offering it, but stating it, placing it in the space between them with quiet finality. Ethan's grip on the phone tightened slightly, the name settling into him with a weight that felt both new and overdue. Caleb, he repeated, as if saying it might bring him closer to something he had missed, but it did not. It only made the absence clearer. You do not get to decide what happens next. Amara continued, her voice steady, not defensive, not emotional, just defined. You made that choice a long time ago. The words were not sharp, but they did not need to be, because truth does not require force to land. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his free hand pressing against the desk as if grounding himself in something solid. I did not know, he said, not as an excuse, but as a fact he was only now beginning to understand the weight of. On the other end, Amara's silence returned, not dismissive, but measured, and when she spoke again, it was softer, but no less firm. You did not ask. The line held for a moment longer, neither of them rushing to fill it, because there was nothing left to hide behind, no space for interpretation, only the quiet truth that had been there from the beginning. And in that moment, Ethan realized that some losses do not come from what you were denied, but from what you never chose to see when it was right in front of you. The line did not disconnect right away, and in that quiet stretch of shared silence, something shifted, not between them, but within Ethan, as if the absence he had just been forced to face was no longer abstract, but anchored in something real, something living. He stood there with the phone still at his ear, his reflection faint in the glass behind his desk, and for the first time, he did not recognize the man looking back at him as someone in control, but as someone catching up to a life already in motion. I want to meet him, he said finally, the words slower now, not demanded, not assumed, but placed carefully into the space between them as if they might break if handled the wrong way. On the other end, Amara did not respond immediately, and that pause carried more meaning than any immediate answer could have, because it was not hesitation, it was evaluation, the kind that comes from someone who has nothing to prove and everything to protect. Why? She asked, her voice calm, not challenging, but direct, as if the answer mattered more than the request itself. Ethan lowered himself into his chair, the motion uncharacteristically deliberate, as he considered the question, not searching for the right words, but for the honest ones, something he had not needed in a long time. Because he is my son, he said, and the statement, simple as it was, did not carry ownership, it carried realization. There was another pause, softer this time, and when Amara spoke again, her tone did not change, but something beneath it did, something that acknowledged the weight of what had just been said without yielding to it. He is my son too, she replied. And for 5 years, I was the only one who showed up. The truth settled between them, not sharp, but immovable, and Ethan felt it in a way that no report, no file, no data ever could. Because this was not information, it was consequence. He leaned forward slightly, his hand pressing against the edge of the desk again, a habit forming without his awareness. I am not asking to take anything from you, he said, his voice steady but quieter than before. I am asking for a chance to know him. The words lingered, not dramatic, not emotional, but real in a way that could not be negotiated. Across the city, Amara stood by the window of her office, the light catching the edges of her profile as she looked out over a view she had built for herself, her reflection faint against the glass, layered over everything she had created without him. She closed her eyes briefly, not to escape, but to measure the moment against everything that had come before it. The nights she held Caleb when he cried without understanding why. The mornings she woke before the sun to make sure their life stayed steady. The years she carried both roles without complaint, without recognition, without pause. When she opened her eyes again, Her voice carried that history within it, not as a burden, but as a foundation. A chance is not something you ask for, she said quietly. It is something you earn. Ethan exhaled slowly, the air leaving him in a way that felt heavier than it should have, because for once, there was no immediate solution, no clear path forward, only a process he could not control. Then tell me how, he said, and the question, simple as it was, marked the first time he had asked for direction instead of giving it. The silence that followed was not empty. It was measured, as if Amara was deciding not just what to say, but whether he was ready to hear it. You start by understanding that you are not stepping into an empty space, she replied. You are stepping into a life that already exists, with rules you did not create. Ethan nodded slightly. Even though she could not see it, the motion instinctive, as if agreeing with something he had already begun to accept. Outside his window, the city moved as it always did, steady, indifferent, but inside, something had shifted, not loudly, not visibly, but fundamentally. This was no longer about reclaiming what he thought was his. It was about proving he could be part of something he had never built. And for the first time, Ethan Whitmore understood that presence is not defined by intention, it is defined by consistency. By showing up when there is no audience, no recognition, no guarantee of acceptance, and that was something no amount of power could substitute. The call ended without a formal goodbye, not out of disrespect, but because neither of them needed to fill the silence with something unnecessary. And as the line went still, Ethan remained seated, the phone resting in his hand longer than it should have, as if letting go of it too quickly would undo the shift that had just taken place. The room around him felt unchanged, the same polished surfaces, the same skyline stretching endlessly beyond the glass. Yet something in the way he occupied that space had altered, subtle but irreversible. For the first time, he did not reach for the next task, the next meeting, the next decision, because there was no immediate action that could resolve what had just been set in motion. Instead, he stood slowly and walked toward the window, his reflection faint against the city beyond. A man who had always moved forward now pausing in a way that felt unfamiliar but necessary. Across town, Amara sat at her desk for a moment longer after the call, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table, her gaze steady, not distant, not overwhelmed, simply present. She had expected this moment, not in detail, but in essence, the moment when the past would reach forward and ask for space in a life she had already built without it. Her phone remained silent now, but the weight of the conversation lingered, not as a disruption, but as something to be acknowledged, measured, and placed where it belonged. Later that afternoon, the school parking lot filled with the quiet hum of engines and the soft rhythm of children's voices spilling into the open air, backpacks shifting, laughter rising and falling in waves that carried no awareness of the complexities that shaped the adults around them. Amara stood near the sidewalk, her posture relaxed, but attentive, her eyes scanning the entrance not with urgency, but with familiarity. When Caleb appeared, his small frame moving with that same steady confidence, she felt the subtle easing in her chest that came every time she saw him safe, present, unchanged by the world outside. He spotted her quickly and walked over, his steps unhurried, his expression calm. "We learned about planets today," he said, as if the day held nothing more complicated than that, and she smiled softly, kneeling slightly to meet his height. "Which one did you like most?" she asked, brushing a piece of lint from his sleeve. "Saturn," he answered, "because it has rings that make it different." And she nodded. "Different does not mean alone," she said gently, a quiet truth woven into a simple response. They walked toward the car together, their pace matching without thought, a rhythm built over years that did not need adjustment. As she opened the door for him, her phone vibrated once in her bag. A message this time, not a call, and though she did not check it immediately, she knew who it was from without needing to see the screen. Across the city, Ethan sat at a smaller table than usual, not in a boardroom, not in a space designed for authority, but in a quiet corner of his own building, the kind of place he had passed countless times without noticing. A notebook lay open in front of him, blank pages waiting, and for a moment he simply looked at them, as if unsure where to begin, because this was not a strategy to be outlined or a deal to be structured. This was something slower, something that required presence instead of precision. He picked up the pen and hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of unfamiliarity, then began to write. Not numbers, not plans, but questions, simple ones, basic ones, the kind he had never needed to ask before. What Caleb liked, what he feared, what he needed, what he deserved. The act felt almost foreign, yet necessary, like learning a language he should have known years ago. Back in the car, Caleb buckled his seatbelt with practiced ease, then looked at Amara for a moment, his eyes thoughtful. Is he going to come back? He asked, not anxious, not hopeful, just curious in the way children are when something new enters their understanding. Amara paused, her hand resting lightly on the steering wheel, not rushing to answer, because honesty required care, not speed. She turned slightly toward him, her voice calm, steady. He might try, she said. But what matters is what we choose, not what he wants. And Caleb nodded, accepting the answer without needing more, because trust had already been built in every moment before this one. As the car pulled away, the late afternoon light stretched across the road, long shadows marking the passage of time without urgency. And somewhere between what had been and what was coming, both of them moved forward, not waiting, not chasing, simply continuing a life that had never paused, even when someone else finally decided to notice it. The evening settled slowly, the kind of quiet that did not announce itself but arrived gently, filling the spaces between moments with something steady and real. And inside Amara's home, the light was warm, soft against the walls that had witnessed every version of her becoming. Caleb sat at the small table with his homework spread out in front of him, pencil in hand, his brow slightly furrowed in concentration as he worked through a problem with the same quiet patience he carried in everything he did. Amara stood nearby, not hovering, not directing, just present, her attention moving between him and the simple rhythm of preparing dinner, the sound of a pan warming, the faint clink of utensils grounding the space in something familiar. Her phone rested on the counter, screen dark, but she knew it would not stay that way for long. Across the city, Ethan remained in the same quiet corner of his building, the notebook in front of him no longer empty, pages now filled with words that did not solve anything, but began to reveal what he had never taken the time to understand. The city outside had shifted into night, lights rising in patterns that once symbolized achievement, but now felt like a reminder of distance, of how much could exist beyond his reach. His phone lay beside the notebook, a message drafted but unsent, the words simple, stripped of anything unnecessary, because for the first time, he understood that nothing elaborate would change what had already been lost. Back in the kitchen, Caleb looked up, his voice breaking the quiet in a way that felt natural. Mom, do you think people can change? He asked, not looking away from his paper, as if the question had simply found its way into the room. Amara paused for a moment, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the counter, considering not just the answer, but the truth behind it. Yes, she said finally, her voice calm, certain. But only if they are willing to see what they have done, not just what they want to fix. Caleb nodded slightly, accepting the answer in the way children do, without needing to challenge it, then returned to his work, the question settling into him as something to understand later. The phone buzzed softly against the counter, the screen lighting up with a name she no longer needed to react to. And this time, she picked it up, not out of urgency, but out of choice. She read the message once, her expression unchanged, then set it back down, not replying, not dismissing, simply allowing it to exist without giving it control. Miles away, Ethan finally pressed send, the message leaving his phone with a weight that felt disproportionate to its length, because it carried more than words. It carried intention without guarantee. He leaned back slightly, his eyes closing for a brief moment, not in exhaustion, but in acceptance of something he could not accelerate, could not command. Time, for the first time, was not something he could leverage. It was something he had to move within, in the quiet of her home. Amara turned off the stove, the meal finished, the evening continuing in the same steady rhythm it always had. And as she sat down across from Caleb, their hands briefly touching as she passed him his plate, there was a sense of completeness that did not rely on anything outside those walls. The world beyond them could shift, could return, could ask for space. But what they had built did not pause, did not bend. It simply continued, grounded in every choice she had made when no one was watching. Later that night, as Caleb slept, his breathing soft and even, Amara stood by the window, looking out at the quiet street, the same calm settling over her that had carried her through every uncertain moment before. She did not wonder what would happen next, because she no longer lived in anticipation of someone else's actions. She lived in the certainty of her own. And somewhere across the city, Ethan Whitmore sat in a room filled with everything he had ever worked for, yet understanding for the first time that what mattered most was not what he could build, but what he was willing to become. Because some lives are not entered through power or permission, they are entered through patience, humility, and the quiet act of showing up long after it would have been easier not to.